This is Shop Talk with Writers.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Shop Talk with Writers, the podcast where we discover the stories behind the books. I'm Elena Lapin, and my guest today is Armand D'Angour, Professor of Classics at Jesus College, Oxford, and author of books that bring the ancient world much closer to our own. His most recent one is How to Talk About Love, an Ancient Guide for Modern Lovers, a selection of D'Angour's own translations from Plato's masterpiece, the Symposium. We met at Armand D'Angour's home in North London and explored the concept of love, yes, only the concept, in an atmosphere full of ancient history and music. Armand D'Angour is also a classical musician. Enjoy. Armand D'Angour.
Hello.
Welcome to Shop Talk with Writers. We are here to talk about your book, How to Talk About Love, which you say in your subtitle is an ancient guide for modern lovers.
Right.
Can you explain that subtitle before we dive any deeper?
Well, it's part of a series of how-to books which take ancient texts and then say an ancient guide to X, Y, or Z. So in this particular case, what was it going to be an ancient guide to? I mean, it could have been an ancient guide to erotic passion or something of that kind, but I think the publisher decided it was simplest to say for modern lovers.
But it has to do with putting what we know, what we think, what we feel about love into words and thoughts.
Yes, the reason for the title is that this essentially takes an ancient text, Plato's Symposium, a dialogue, and in that you have 7 men giving different viewpoints about what love is. So again, the title one had to think about. It could have been how to think about love, or but the thing is, they are talking. So it's part of a symposium. An ancient symposium was a party which involved drink, but in this case they decide not to drink, and they talk about love. So How to Talk About Love seemed to be the right title.
Well, the reason they decided not to drink is because they had drunk too much the night before. They were all hungover, is that right?
Yes, so Plato sets this dialogue, sets this conversation at a date which we know is 416 BC, because that's when the host of the party, a man called Agathon, won a prize for tragedy in the tragic festival in Athens. And the following night, we're told, they celebrated and they all got drunk. And then they reconvened for a second bout of drinking and fun, but decided that they'd already done too much of that, so they'll do something else. So that's how he sets up this dialogue. We have no idea whether it's genuine, whether there's any historical truth to that setup, but it's quite a clever idea. A symposium which doesn't involve drink. I mean, the word symposium means drinking party.
So the book has a pink cover and an embracing couple, a statue of an embracing couple on the cover, which to our modern mind seems to indicate pink being the color of romantic love,
and
perhaps.
That was my choice.
I don't know.
Pleased to say.
Yeah. But Plato, as I read it, Plato conceived of this or wrote it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but to me it reads like a piece of fiction. It's a conversation, it's a dialogue. It's, as you said, 7 men talking. How fictionalized a situation is this in order to express those thoughts?
It's wholly fictionalized in that sense. So what we get is an account given by someone who heard it from someone else who, reported it to a third person. So you've got this very distant introduction, and the talks are very carefully arranged by Plato. So although the narrator tells us that there were some other talks that he didn't remember. Plato clearly doesn't want to give us anything that literally reports what happens in a real symposium. He wants to give us a series of thoughts that add up to something that he feels is important to say about love.
Relevant to this particular discussion.
Yes.
Why did Plato want to have a discussion written down about love?
Well, that's a very big question. I mean, why did Plato compose all his 30-odd dialogues, most of which have Socrates as the main interlocutor? And, well, the reason he set about doing that was that he was a very devoted pupil of Socrates, and he would have been around 25 when Socrates was executed. So he'd have known him perhaps for about 10 years as this wonderful, brilliant interlocutor and philosopher. And so he starts by giving a report of Socrates' defense speech at the trial, the so-called Plato's Apology, which again, up to a point may be fictional. We don't know exactly. I mean, he may well have been there, he may have taken notes, but we don't really know whether this is exactly what Socrates said. And then he continues to write what we call dialogues. They aren't necessarily two people, they could be more, but interlocutors with Socrates about a whole range of different philosophical subjects. And eventually he gets around to writing about love. And I think we can assume that Socrates did talk about many of the things that we learn from Plato's dialogues. So, for example, in a dialogue called Meno, he talks about what happens to the soul after you die, and he brings in a mathematical proof of a geometrical proof that shows that we have knowledge which we might call a priori, so it comes from somewhere, and he wants to say it comes from a realm where our souls are in contact with true knowledge. So that sounds like possibly something Socrates did actually do. He has another dialogue called Laches, which he talks about courage. Laches is a soldier. So it's an opportunity for Plato to range around different philosophical themes and to tell us either what Socrates said or what Plato thinks Socrates should have said.
Really interesting, because you also have a book called Socrates and Love. What is the relationship between that book and Socrates in this book?
They're very closely connected because Socrates and Love emerged from my reading of the Symposium, and in particular of a central aspect of the Symposium in which Socrates himself, after 5 other speakers have given their ideas about love, says, "I'll tell you the truth about love." And that's a very surprising comment coming from Socrates, because he's famous for saying, "All I know is that I don't know." So when he says, "I'll tell you the truth about love," it should suggest that he knows about love, which is not an insignificant part of human life. And he goes on to say, "Because I was taught it by a very clever woman." And that's where most scholars have said, oh, well, this is Plato making up something. Socrates was never taught anything, let alone by a woman. But that is what he says in this dialogue. And he said, "I used to hear her talk about love, and this is what she said." And he then reports a doctrine which he attributes to a woman whose name he gives as Diotima, or Diotima, a name which means honoured by Zeus. Now, I didn't really think too hard about why he used that name. People have tried to find out whether there was a real woman called Diotima. They don't have much success. We don't know anything independently about her. So it's assumed she's a fiction. But there was another part of Socrates' introduction of this very clever woman, which I did find much more intriguing. And that is, he says, she was a clever woman, and when the Athenians were sacrificing to avert the plague, she succeeded in warding it off for 10 years. And I thought, why on earth does he give this very curiously specific bit of information about this woman? What does it mean? So I looked in all the commentaries, and they really had nothing to say about it. It's like this is perhaps some kind of local colour about Diotima being a clever woman who managed to do something witchy to do with sacrificing. And then they said, perhaps there were plagues going around. So amazingly, actually this very specificity of that phrase was watered down. But I decided to take it quite literally and think, what would have been the cause of a plague 10 years before the plague actually struck, which was in 430 BC? And what happened 10 years before to suggest that somebody had actually managed to delay it? And then it was an amazing revelation, because any historian of that period will tell you, if you mention 440 BC, they'll say, yes, that's when Pericles invaded the island of Samos. And he did so, according to the comic poets of the time, at the behest of his wife or mistress, Aspasia, who came from the rival city of Miletus. And there was this campaign, of which we're told in some detail by a later historian of Samos, a man called Duris, in which Pericles acted really rather badly. He succeeded in the campaign. The Athenians subdued the island, and he had the opposing commanders strung up on crosses in the square in Miletus, and he ordered that their bodies should be thrown out without burial. So the thing that I think any ancient Athenian would immediately think in response to such an action, sacrilegious in their view, would be it was courting divine punishment. And the most commonplace divine punishment, one that goes all the way back to the Iliad, is the gods send a plague. So it seems very likely to me that because of his actions on Samos, Pericles was thought to have courted plague, but no plague transpired in 440. And 10 years later, there was the Great Plague of Athens. It was ghastly. It's wonderfully described by the historian Thucydides, some kind of typhus, we think. And thousands died in horrible agony, and Pericles died. So that one convoluted sentence with which Socrates introduces this clever woman immediately put Aspasia in the picture in 440, when Pericles conquered Samos and did the sacrilegious act. Somebody, according to this particular testimony, a woman, arranged for sacrifices and succeeded in averting the plague by 10 years. That's the kind of retrospective thing people might have said when the plague hit Athens. They said, this is the long-awaited plague that we would have expected 10 years ago. But somebody did something then. Who was it? A woman arranged for sacrifices. Now, who could that woman have been? Well, first of all, there is no other clever woman in the picture in ancient Athens. Aspasia of Miletus was notoriously clever. She was lampooned for being very clever, and she was derided by misogynistic comedians. So that's one thing. So talking about a clever woman at that period immediately points to her. But also this notion of the postponement of the plague. I mean, clearly that would have been done in order to help Pericles to avert, what was seen to be coming to him. So that nexus of ideas led me to think further about Aspasia of Miletus, and there's quite a lot of evidence about her that is preserved. Some contemporary writers had written biographies of her, which were quoted in later writers, and there was actually a writer called Clearchus, who was a pupil of Aristotle, and we have fragments of Clearchus's writings, and generally he's considered to be quite a scholarly individual. And he said before Aspasia was with Pericles, she was with Socrates. He actually says that. And that's always been dismissed. I mean, well, yes, it's just a sort of bit of gossip. But if you take it seriously, then, the word was with in Greek, synagenitor, is a bit vague, had a relationship with, hung out with. But it's, whatever she did, hanging out with Pericles, she had done previously with Socrates. And so that's where I then created the notion that Socrates may well have actually had a love affair with Aspasia. They were of the same age. She was from Miletus, which was outside of Athens, across the Aegean Sea, Ionia, what's known as Asia Minor. And she had come to Athens. We can reconstruct what she did. She had probably come to Athens when she was about 20, and when Socrates was about 20, in around 460 BC. And there seems to have been a period when she was unmarried and was holding salons in Athens. So we're told this by a report of a biography of Aspasia by Cicero, much, much later. And those salons included Athenian elite individuals, including Socrates, we're told. So we have some sort of connection with Socrates saying, I went to hear this woman talk about love. Those salons in which he talks about love and marriage seem to be the kind of thing that Socrates is saying Diotima did. Now, whether Socrates and Aspasia did have a love affair is, we just don't know. And we could take that Clearchus seriously and assume that they did. But they were clearly in the same circle. So Socrates had been in the circle of Pericles for quite a long time. So he would have met Aspasia. She then beguiles Pericles, and Pericles falls in love with Aspasia, famously honours her. She becomes notorious for being tremendously influential. But the idea that someone should be then called honoured by Zeus immediately raises the pseudonym that was given to Pericles, which was Zeus. So Pericles was, the commanding politician of the day. He was a great orator. He thundered, and so the comic playwrights of the day called Pericles Zeus, and they called his wife or consort. In fact, they thought of her as some kind of brothel madam who had attached herself to him. They called her Hera, the wife of Zeus, because she was supposedly very influential and powerful, and they made up stories about her. The idea that she literally ran a brothel and procured freeborn girls for Pericles, that sort of thing is what they said, and alas, it has been taken seriously by historians for centuries. She was some kind of brothel madam. Now, she was with Pericles for at least 15 years, until he died in the plague in 429. So she was with him from 445, and we can kind of date that because they had a son who became a general, and you had to be 30 to be a general, and he was a general in 406. So we can more or less say they had to have been together around that period.
What was the lifespan?
So some of the well-known figures in ancient Athens lived to ripe old ages. Something like the plague obviously was going to cut off a lot of people in their prime, and a lot of soldiers died young.
But it's not as if they lived just into their 40s, because they seem to have been extremely busy. with long-term relationships for a long time. 15 years with Pericles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, Socrates himself was executed at the age of 70, so he might have lived on another 10 years.
So, Armand, if we get back to this book, what's in this book, because this is all extremely fascinating. And but before we get back to the book, I just want to ask, how exciting is it for you to discover a little revelation, a document, something that points in a new direction, and then going there?
It's hugely exciting, and as an academic and a classicist, that's something that I find I want to do all the time. Dig into the materials, dig into the documentation, and see if something emerges that hasn't been seen before.
Yeah.
Not everybody is that way inclined. A lot of people are happy to repeat the sort of wisdom of the past, you might say. But I just, and I'm not saying I set out to do that, but I think that I'm naturally inclined to ask those questions. So I was teaching, actually, the history of this period using Plato's Symposium and a play by Aristophanes, the comic poet, called Clouds, for maybe 15 years, and not recognizing any of this, not really trying to track down who this Diotima character might have been, or any further information about Socrates, because we learn about Socrates in Aristophanes' play, a younger version of the one that most of us think of. But it started to come together. And one of the ways it came together for me was I wanted to ask, what was Socrates like as a younger man? Because all the biographers, the two main biographers, Plato and Xenophon, knew him when he was an old man, and they talk about him as an old man in his 60s. And they hint at the fact that he was a soldier in his earlier career, and that perhaps he attended the salon of a woman and learned about love. There's a hint of all these things, but I want to know if we could find out something that really told us why the young Socrates turned into the old Socrates. And that's when I stumbled on this particular identification of Diotima as Aspasia. Now, it's not a wholesale identification, and I say that in How to Talk About Love.
Yeah.
So, slight difference from my Socrates in Love 2019 to How to Talk About Love 2026 is that, 2025, I've gone a year forward, is that in the interim, I had to tackle the criticism that Diotima couldn't have been Aspasia because her doctrine of love ends up with something that is purely Platonic, and that is the idea of the forms. So this is part of Plato's philosophy, that the world as we know it is just, as it were, a shadow of the real world, which consists of perfect objects and virtues and qualities. And that real world is the world of what he calls the forms, the form of the good, of beauty, but even the form of a table and a chair. And that is the culmination of Diotima's instruction about love. And it's obviously clear that Socrates couldn't have heard Diotima or Aspasia say anything of that kind. He himself wouldn't have been aware of it. It was something Plato came up with perhaps 20 or 30 years after Socrates had died. And so that immediately was seen as an obstacle to this identification. So I reread the dialogue, and what you have is, he says, Diotima said that love, eros, begins with physical attraction for a body. And then it broadens into an attraction for many bodies, and then an attraction to the beauty that is in those bodies. So she could have said all of that. And then she says, one can then rise on the ladder of love, so that's the image, and start to love things like laws and customs. Essentially, your city, patriotism is a form of love of your city. And then she says, Diotima, or is made to say by Plato, up until this point, Socrates, even you can be initiated. But I'm not sure whether you can. You've got to really pay attention to what I'm now saying. So it's almost as if Plato is saying that is the point at which Aspasia's doctrine would have stopped. And from that point on, you're getting a doctrine which even Socrates isn't able to understand because it's Plato's later doctrine of the forms.
Yes.
I think it's a clear indication by Plato that he has moved on and put into Diotima's mouth something that Aspasia hadn't said, and that immediately explains why he cannot call this figure Aspasia. I mean, there are other reasons too. He doesn't necessarily want Socrates to be thought of as having learned his craft from a woman, let alone a woman who was very disreputable according to a lot of contemporary authors. So there are reasons why he wouldn't have done so. But the fact is he does use Aspasia's name in another dialogue, the Menexenus, and there he has a teaching Socrates how to give a speech, a funeral speech. And she says, I told him, I'll tell you the speech that I taught Pericles. Now, Pericles gave a very famous funeral speech in 430 BC. It's reported by the historian Thucydides, wonderful speech of patriotism about Athens. And the implication of Plato's Menexenus is that Aspasia wrote it for Pericles. So, of course, everybody's dismissed that as well. Scholars are very selective about what they decide Plato is telling us biographically and what he's not. But I thought, perhaps Aspasia was indeed a teacher of eloquence, as she's portrayed, and perhaps she did contribute at least to the writing of Pericles' speech. So I went back to the Thucydides text, and again you find elements there which rather convince me that Aspasia had a hand in Pericles, and notably, for example, he says to his audience, you must be lovers of the city. Erastai, which is a specific word, you find it a lot in the Symposium. And the idea that you have to love your city, of course, is exactly what Diotima says, and it's the point at which I think Plato breaks off and says, that's her doctrine, the rest of it is mine. So that was one thing. Subsequently, quite interestingly, a critic of my theory said that, published a commentary on the Menexenus, and he pointed out in several places that there's a collocation of Greek particles. So ancient Greek uses little particles meaning indeed and so on. And they, in a certain style, you can find these particles in all sorts of speeches. But he says this particular grouping of particles is found nowhere else other than in Aspasia's speech in the Menexenus and Pericles' speech in Thucydides. So although he was critical of my theory, he went on to show that there's more evidence for it.
Yes.
So I think that there is quite abundant evidence now that Plato was thinking of Aspasia when he was writing about the earlier part of the doctrine of love of Diotima.
And if we get back to the drinking party, which is this book, the Symposium, which, by the way, the structure of it is fascinating. As you said, we have 7 men. Let's just break down who they are exactly and what the sequence is in which they speak about love.
So it begins with a young aristocrat called Phaedrus. So the men have decided they're going to dispense with drink and they're going to have a discussion instead. And Phaedrus, who we know from another dialogue of Plato called Phaedrus, is keen on the whole question of love. So in the dialogue, Phaedrus, he's trying to repeat a speech that he heard in which an orator is trying to say something about love.
Something abstract?
No, actually, in that particular case, it's about trying to make his affections known to a beloved. So Phaedrus is interested in that subject, and he says here in the Symposium, love has never been properly hymned by the poets. So what I suggest is that we give speeches in praise of this wonderful character. Of course, eros in Greek, is a god, and to speak in praise of Eros, it's a slightly, well, it's, you have to think that this is a kind of concrete way in which you're saying love is great because, but in the course of these speeches, there's definitely an intermingling of the idea that Eros is actually a divine character of some kind. And you can say he's the youngest of the gods, he's the oldest of the gods, and this is the kind of thing they say. So Phaedrus says he's the oldest of the gods because he was the firstborn, according to one of the poems which tells us about the origins of the world and of the gods. That's Hesiod's Theogony. In it, after earth and heaven are created, love comes into being. So Phaedrus takes that as saying love is the oldest in the sense of the earliest. And there's an equivocation there because, oldest could mean he's, an aged man with a long white beard, as opposed to a little boy, which he then comes to be known as. Eros becomes Cupid with his arrows, this kind of little putto that you sometimes see in Renaissance paintings, a mischievous child shooting his arrows at would-be lovers. So Phaedrus says he's the oldest, and we should therefore praise him because he's been around for so long and given us his blessings for such a long time. And then he goes on to give his own view of what this god inspires. And what he inspires, according to Phaedrus, is people to die for those they love. So this is a very militaristic take, and you have to remember that young Athenian men all fought in battles. The more aristocratic you were, the more you were expected to have your horse and your armour all ready to fight. And there was a lot of fighting going on. And so he says, if you had an army of lovers, then they would be invincible because one would be ashamed to act in a cowardly fashion before the person one loves. And so he takes it to be for granted that we're talking about male lovers, which of course existed, and certainly in
this entire discussion, this entire session of exchanges of views is all about male love.
Well, it's a bunch of men. They've actually sent away the music maker, who would have been a woman, playing the double pipes. And the host of the party, Agathon, is well known to be in a homosexual relationship with an older man who's also there, a man called Pausanias, who speaks second. So it is very oriented towards homosexual love. But having said that, when Phaedrus says love inspires you to die for the person you love, the first example he gives is Alcestis. And Alcestis was the wife of Admetus. Admetus had been told that if he could find someone to die in his stead, then he could live beyond his allotted lifespan. And so he asks his aged parents, and they aren't interested. And then Alcestis volunteers and says, well, if you're going to have to die, I'd prefer to die in your stead because I'd be left on my own with the children and so on. So she bravely volunteers to die in his place. So this is a play by Euripides, 438 BC.
Yes, and is that kind of concept of fidelity until the end?
Yeah.
To die for yes, your beloved?
Yes, absolutely. Faithful relationship to the person you love. And, the idea is that Phaedrus is saying it goes to that extreme, that love makes you prepared to even die for the person you love. Yeah, I mean, it's, as it were, highly romantic notion that a young man will give. And he gives other examples, Achilles and Patroclus, for example. So Achilles went into battle knowing he was going to die in order to avenge his beloved Patroclus.
Yeah.
And so on. That's the opening speech. And that is then followed by a speech by Pausanias, as I say, the older lover of the host, Agathon, in which he says, well, Phaedrus is right that love is inspiring, but only good love, because there's good love and bad love. So he makes a big distinction between what we might say is true love and sex. And he does so really from the point of view of a homosexual man in ancient Athens, in which there was clearly some concern about the notion that older men were forming relationships with much younger ones, which, in fact,
boys,
with boys. Really? So the word in Greek pais means boy, and boy love is paiderastia, which leads to our word pederasty. Some people would say, well, pais didn't mean a prepubescent. And in fact, that is also made clear in this dialogue, that you don't chase a boy until the hair starts forming on his cheeks and chin. So let's say a boy of the age of 13 or 14 who's into puberty is someone who an older man might take under his wing in a perfectly benign way, and that relationship could develop into a sexual one. I think it didn't always, but sometimes did. But it clearly was a matter of concern in Athens, and perhaps in other Greek states, some of which banned that kind of interchange. And one of the reasons for that would be, I suspect, that the fathers of young boys would think, I don't want my 13-year-old going off with this, however distinguished, but I don't want him going off with some older philosopher or politician. Anyway, that is the implication of Pausanias' speech, in which he makes this strong distinction, and he says, it's all right if you're going to be a committed lover and you're committed to the young boy who you take under your wing, you're committed to his education, to his socialization, you are giving something to the soul of that youngster. But it's not all right if you're just doing it for sex. And then he says, there's people who have sex with a youngster and then rush off and have sex with someone else. That's bad. So he makes that strong distinction, but you can see the reason he's doing it is it's a culturally vexed issue, and possibly was one that Plato himself felt needed to be discussed in that kind of detail. It's a very long speech.
So this isn't really philosophy, is it? It's a kind of...
No, but it's couched in philosophical terms. So he talks about divine Aphrodite as opposed to vulgar Aphrodite. So you could say, he's creating a story of gods, who approve of one kind of activity over another. And it's philosophical only in, I suppose, in the to the degree that he's making an ethical distinction.
Yes.
So what he's saying is that there's a certain kind of love that is ethical and a certain kind of love that is not, and we should be concentrating on the right kind of love. So that's what he says, and then...
Is the next speaker the doctor?
Yes. So
great, because when the doctor jumps in, I got very excited. I thought that was fascinating what he was saying, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, it is fascinating. And what happens in the course of this dialogue, so they are passing the speeches from left to right around the room. So you have to imagine these men are in a dining room on couches.
Just like we are here.
Yeah. reclining on couches. Yes, you have to imagine us reclining. And they're passing the speech round from left to right. And the next person in that row was, in fact, the comic poet Aristophanes.
Uh-huh.
But he, we're told, had a fit of hiccups. So ever a funny man.
That's so funny.
Yes.
This is Plato's fictional intervention in that situation to actually make it funny.
Yes, I think that's right.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
And in order to I love that, by the way, I love that you drew a diagram in your book to show who spoke when, who followed whom. That's great.
So you can see in that diagram that Aristophanes is the next person who should have spoken, but it bypasses him because he's having the hiccups, and it goes to the doctor, who is Eryximachus. And Eryximachus takes us into a different world. So with Phaedrus and with Pausanias, we've been talking about, the love of men for men, really. But Eryximachus makes it all much more abstract, and he says love is about the harmonizing of opposites. And he said, I'll start with my own profession, medicine. And in medicine, you have all these opposite qualities in the body, hot and cold, wet and dry. It's a bit like, the theory of qi.
Healthy and sick.
Yeah, well, healthy and sick. And what you have to try and do is harmonize, bring things into balance so that the body is healthy. And he says it's the same thing with music. You have fast notes, slow notes, fast rhythms, slow rhythms. You have high notes, low notes. And a good tune is one that brings these into some kind of balance so that you have music. And then he says, and in fact, nature is like that. So you have hot seasons and cold seasons and wet seasons and dry seasons. And the idea is that it should all balance out. And so he brings the notion of eros into the universe. And actually, that's something that goes way back in Greek philosophy. The idea that love is a harmonizing or unifying force of material things goes back to, for example, at least, a philosopher called Empedocles, who is mentioned in this dialogue. And he's saying that's what we should think about eros, this force for the harmonization of things. So you get a sort of abstract sense of, the erotics of music, the erotics of medicine, the erotics of nature. The idea that it's something abstract. It's about harmonization and balance. Mm-hmm. And what's happening here is Plato is gradually introducing us to different concepts about how we might think about love. There isn't anything overtly romantic. So, of course, when we talk about love, we often really think about romantic love, but there isn't an awful lot of that in this dialogue.
No.
No, but you might say that the next speech, which is Aristophanes, after he's finished with his hiccups, he then comes in and gives his talk. I mean, in some ways, it is the most romantic of all, even though it is overtly just a piece of comedy. So Plato has put into his mouth a really comic scenario in which human beings, he says, originally had 4 arms and 4 legs. We were this kind of roly-poly characters with 2 faces looking either way. And we were so pleased with ourselves that we tried to assault the
rolling
gods.
Around?
Yeah, rolling around like tumblers, he says.
Where were the genitals in that scenario?
Yes. So he talks about the genitals being inside.
Oh, inside.
Yes.
Hidden.
Not
really
yes. And
functional.
he said people, what you had is male, female, and male, halves. So it was possible to, for the male-female half, the hermaphroditic, to give birth, but they did so in a hole in the ground, he says. Anyway, so that's what these human beings were like originally. They got too big for their boots, so Zeus, chief of the gods, and I think it is important.
Too big for their 4 boots,
for their
because
4
they
boots.
have 4 legs.
Indeed, yes. He split them in half, and he split us humans in half. And he says, like a wire through an egg. A wonderful image.
Yeah.
And when we were split in half, we were desperate to get back to our original wholeness. and then half of us started dying off, and weren't able to do that. So we were looking for that wholeness. And he says that's what love is, looking for your other half. So I think that
actually he goes from a humorous, funny, not serious image or storytelling to something that's quite profound.
Something that a lot of people would say, is romantically true, is psychologically true. We are looking for some kind of sense of completion in looking and finding another half for our lives. But there's a problem with it, of course, and that is that if you come together in a sense of perfect self-satisfaction, then you're never going to learn. So this is something that Socrates is going to pick up on.
Yes.
What you do need that kind of imbalance that has already been presented to us by Phaedrus and Pausanias, the older man and the younger lover. But the reason you need it is so that there is movement in the relationship and growth. Whereas if it was just finding someone who's just like you, your mirror image, and getting together with them, that would be that. You'd be boringly self-satisfied and nothing, no interesting growth would result.
And that growth comes out of the whole sort of chemistry of the two halves seeking each other, coming together, coming apart, returning.
But also being on different levels.
Yes.
So for love really to work, you need someone who is at a higher level, who knows more and who's dragging up the other. So, it is a slightly unbalanced picture, because you have to say, well, what about the older person, as it were? I mean, how are they benefiting, other than through sexual gratification or whatever? It's not absolutely clear what the answer to that is, but you do need that slightly unbalanced relationship for it to be true love, I think, for Plato. Mm-hmm. And, Aristophanes has his say, and then the final speech in this first group of 5 speeches is by the host, Agathon himself, who, of course, is a tragedian, so he is good with words, and he gives a very flowery speech in which he talks about love being the inspirer of creation. So artistic creation, but creativity in general is what love inspires. So we've had all these speeches then looking at love. You're prepared to die for love. You've got to make sure it's good, not bad. It's an abstraction of harmonization. It's finding your other half, and it's creative. And all of those elements are going to be wrapped in to the central speech in the dialogue, which is that of Socrates, which he attributes to this clever woman, Diotima.
Can I just mention that as I was reading through the speeches, and I'm finding them very interesting, each one in their own way, and then Socrates comes in, or the speech about Socrates, or Socrates about her, and that whole scene of Socrates rejecting the seduction there's something so dramatic about it, and so human and so real. You actually forget that you're dealing with a dialogue about the philosophy of love, about the ideas about love. It just becomes a situation that is in some kind of a present somewhere, an old man being seduced by a younger man and refusing to be, thus putting the older man, Socrates, the wiser man, on a completely different level.
Yes, well, that actually comes a bit later.
Yes.
So
I've jumped ahead,
the speech that Socrates puts into the mouth of Diotima is the central speech of the dialogue. You're talking about the speech when Alcibiades, the young man, bursts in and then gives the third part of the dialogue, which is the longest section. So, I mean, you're right, we have to ask ourselves, how does that relate?
But isn't that the most interesting bit?
Oh, I think it is. And it's also
it's so exciting.
Yes, and it's the most human. It is exciting. It's biographical, and yes,
it's believable?
Yeah,
and yet not. In a sense, it's
not.
Why
not?
Why would he have rejected?
Right. Okay. So, do you want to just think for a moment about the central speech before we move on to that?
Yes.
Because the way Plato has done this is he's moved on from the five initial speakers. Then he gives us Socrates telling us the truth about love that he heard from Diotima. And the doctrine of Diotima is that love begins with physical attraction for another body. Yes. It becomes attraction for many bodies, and then for the beauty that's in those bodies. And then it goes further up the ladder and becomes love of one's country, love of one's laws and constitutions and so on. And eventually it's the love of the beauty that is creative. So picking up on Agathon, who said that love is creative, he says that, because the lover is loving the beauty in the other, I would define love, Diotima says, as giving birth in relation to beauty. So what that means is that you find someone beautiful, and between the two of you, you create children. That is giving birth in relation to beauty. Or if you're a man and another man, you find something beautiful in the way they think and converse, and you create books or discourses or dialogues. So it is both abstract and concrete. It's both about giving birth. It doesn't, in a way, it spans both. But Diotima uses very physical terms. So she says the lover is pregnant, wanting to give birth. And so that can be pregnant in body or pregnant in mind. Mm-hmm. So that's her doctrine, but it goes up to the final vision of beauty itself, and that is Platonic form of beauty. And that's the bit nobody can really understand. But in a way, that is Plato's own contribution. He's saying, at the height of this all, you have this vision of the unchanging, eternal good. And that is, in a way, the philosopher's quest to attain a vision of truth and goodness. And the philosopher is literally the lover of wisdom. So that's what philosophia is. Mm-hmm. So that form of love, philosophical love, leads to the vision of goodness. And that is, for Plato, the highest form of love. But it isn't for human beings, you see. And that, I think, is why you have Alcibiades bursting into the party. Okay, Alcibiades is this young, beautiful man, sometimes called a playboy. Mary Beard recently said, I think that's a stupid way of
I thought he was beautiful, and I was just reading a dialogue.
So I think he's a playboy because he's a wastrel.
The way he speaks.
Yes.
Throwing my cloak over him.
Exactly. So he's a real show-off, and he is the most beautiful man of his age, and he doesn't give a speech about love. He gives a speech about Socrates, and that's the point. It's like what we've had is an attempt to praise Eros, and now Alcibiades says, well, I'm going to praise Socrates because he is the embodiment of all these things. He's the embodiment of the fortitude that you need to die for love, which Phaedrus has spoken about. For example, he says, he rushed into battle and saved my skin. He did what Phaedrus says. He was prepared to die in order to rescue me because he loved me. So that's a battle of Potidaea in perhaps 430 BC, when they're sharing a tent. And so Alcibiades is probably about 19 or 20 on his first campaign. Socrates is in his 30s, and they're sharing a tent. And he says, I decided I would seduce this wonderful man. And so
he wasn't an old man at the time. He was actually just a bit older.
Well, he was 36, 37.
Yeah, okay.
So he wasn't old and ugly.
No.
As he becomes. But he only becomes that in his
Much
60s when he's finished fighting. So, I mean, that was another thing that I had to make a bit of a point of saying, that everybody always assumes Socrates was always ugly. But there isn't any clear evidence that was the case. As he got older, he lost his hair, he became rather jowly and paunchy. But as a younger man, no evidence at all that he wasn't a fine soldier and a fine physical specimen. So anyway, Alcibiades decides that he wants to seduce him and fails to do so, because he says Socrates was only interested in helping my soul. So there he's picking up on Pausanias' distinction. Socrates was only interested in the right kind of love. Now, you asked earlier, is that realistic? Could Socrates possibly have refrained from actually having sex with this beautiful young man? And, I don't see why not. I mean, it's a big point in the Symposium that he doesn't do so.
I withdraw my question.
Well, the funny thing is that an ancient author did say if he had had sex with Alcibiades, it would have been quite unsurprising. If he didn't, he was an idiot. So, actually, the ancient view was, he probably did. Why not? There was nothing unexpected about that. But Plato makes a big point. I mean, of course, this is where we get the notion of platonic love. You can have sex with someone, but you are actually only interested in their mind or their soul.
You have a beautiful quote somewhere in the book from Sappho.
Oh, yes. Love is who you love.
Yes. But in the context of that quote, she says people admire soldiers and men in battle.
Yes, that's right. No,
but I love to see who I love.
Some say a troop of cavalry or marching men or ships of war, the finest sight on this dark earth. I say it's who you love.
Yes.
And then she goes on to prove it by saying that Helen left her beloved husband Menelaus for Paris, who, of course, she fell in love with. And she finishes off the poem by talking about a young woman that she now brings to mind. And she says, I'd sooner see her lovely walk and sunlight darting on her cheeks than all those Lydian chariots and fighting men at arms. So the idea that, some people think that the sight of troop of horse and so on is amazing. She's saying, what matters is who you love. And I did associate that with what Alcibiades says. It's not about all these abstractions, it's about the person.
Mm-hmm. I find that in a lot of your work, you are a classic scholar, an academic, and so on, but in a lot of your work, you seem to be passionate about bringing that complex knowledge to anyone, and in a language that's accessible. So, for example, in this book, in each section, you explain what it's about, what actually happens. Then you present your translation, your own translation, which you, in your introduction, describe as a not exactly a rewriting, but a slightly freer translation than it would have been if it had been more literal. Facing that page is the actual original ancient Greek. Yeah. So I was very intrigued by that, and I went to my own copy of Plato's Symposium, and I thought, how complicated is it in the original that you felt you had to do this? And to be honest, I didn't find it that complicated. I don't know how good a translation this is.
Translation
I don't know if it's a famous one. It's from the 50s, 1950s.
Yes, I'm just trying to work out who's...
And
this is Jowett's translation. Jowett's translation is marvellous.
Yes.
It is absolutely marvellous. I mean, it was written in Victorian times.
Okay.
And so it's a little bit dated.
Yes.
But he did for his time, and that's why that's a very famous translation.
Yes.
What I'm trying to do for today.
For today, exactly. So I found a parallel there. That was more
no.
accessible.
I think it is, and I think he has also paraphrased things in a way that actually make them truer as translations than if he'd been literal.
Which actually is the art of the best of translations.
I think it has to be, doesn't it?
So this podcast is about writing and writers, and you are a writer in this book. You're not only a scholar and a philosopher and a translator, but you are actually, in a way, putting your own writing talent into sharing this with the modern reader. Now, my question is, why do you do that? Why do you think it's relevant to us to know what Plato and the others may have meant by love?
Why? I am very passionate about trying to help other people see the wonder of the classics, which that happens to be my area. And it actually irritates me when things are obfuscated to the point that people think, I can't really get this. I'm all for Jowett. In fact, Jowett, I'm sorry to say, was derided in his day for his translation. They said, this is Jowett, it's not Plato. So he was the master of Balliol College, Oxford. But I think what he did was absolutely brilliant. I want to do that kind of thing, bring it to an audience who might otherwise find it complex and off-putting. And I have my own personal story about the Symposium, which is that I read it in Greek when I was in my early 20s, I would say, and at university, and thought it was so wonderful because when you're studying something word for word and you really get into it, you start to love it. And I thought there was a young woman who I was interested in. I thought it would make a lovely present. So I bought her the Penguin translation and gave it to her as a present. And a week later, I said, "Well, how are you getting on?" And she said, "I can't make head or tail of it." Now, I don't think it's because that translation was a bad one. I think it's probably quite a good one. But it's still, well, first of all, it was the whole dialogue.
Yeah.
And it's quite a lengthy dialogue. And some of it is culturally very alien. I mean, the whole business of homosexual love and pederasty, for example. And really the one bit that she might have enjoyed most is the speech by Aristophanes about splitting humans in half, if she'd got to it. But even if she had got to it, she might have thought, well, what's that got to do with love? Talking about the god Zeus and human beings. So I realised, rather to my disappointment, that it was not going to be accessible to, and she was a non-classicist. So I had to lick my wounds in that particular case. But many decades later, I thought one of the reasons it is so inaccessible is because it is quite long and quite repetitive in some bits. So Pausanias' speech is very repetitive. And so why not make excerpts of it, which is what I've done here. So shorter excerpts, which give the essence of each section.
Yeah.
And then introduce them so that people know what they are reading about.
You've done this absolutely brilliantly, and I'm sure that if you had occasion to give this to a young lady today,
yes,
she would get through it, or
yes,
anyone else.
Well, I hope so.
highly recommend that. But how did you actually get into the classics? Because I understand you were a musician before you were.
Well, except I was a classicist before I was a musician, so I've been doing both all my life. So I started Latin and Greek in age about 6 and 8, I think it was, and I'd been learning the piano from about the age of 5, and started the cello when I was 10. So it was all done simultaneously. I
Now, what kind of music were you drawn to?
classical music. I mean, in fact, I'm sorry to say I have a very poor understanding of popular music. My wife is always saying to me, "Oh yes, this song, Van Morrison or whatever it is," and I'll go, "What?"
So you need something like this on a musical level.
Yes, I do. I need a sort of basic education of what's good in the pop world.
That's a great idea for someone else
Yes.
to do. But then, how did you get into the classics with such interest and passion?
This was, if you think back in the 1960s, if you went to a prep school, they still taught Latin. Of course, what was key was a really great teacher. So how do I get into the classics? I had a fantastic Latin teacher, and I just loved the way he taught, and he drew brilliant pictures and made it all great fun. John Evans was his name. And he then realised that I was so fascinated by Latin that I should learn Greek as well. So the school wasn't teaching Greek, but he had learned Greek. So he made a little primer for me so that I could learn Greek as well. I love that even more. So that's how
you preferred Greek instantly?
I did, yeah.
Why was that?
I just love the curly letters.
Oh. How about the sounds of it? Because I understand you've kind of resurrected ancient Greek music into actual.
So that's the other thing. I mean,
playing.
I wanted to know what it was like to live in those times. Mm-hmm. So that is a very standard reason for people wanting to do the classics. What was it like in ancient Rome and in ancient Athens? What did it feel like? What did it sound like? So one of the things I did academically was try to learn as much as I could about what we know about pronunciation. So there's a bit of a dispute amongst modern Greeks, for example. They'll say to you, "No, it should be pronounced the way we pronounce our language. You guys don't know what you're doing." But of course, that's not the case any more than English sounded like modern English in the time of Chaucer. It just didn't. Language changes.
So how did the music sound?
So music was a secondary thing. Everybody always said to me, "You're a musician and you're interested in the sound of Greek. So why aren't you telling us about the sound of music in ancient Greece?" And when I was a schoolboy, I discovered a book which had some transcriptions of bits of scores of ancient music. And they were just one line, and they use microtones, so between a tone and a semitone. And I tried to sort of sing them, and they sounded just nothing. So I gave up, and that was back in the 1970s. And people still went on at me about this. So in the 2000s, I came back to it, and eventually I realized that it was possible. There was now a sufficient body of musical scores. I mean, this is the amazing thing. People don't realize that the Greeks had their own notation. So you can look at a piece of writing with little symbols, and that is the score, the melodic score. And there is now really a sufficient body. It's thanks to a really great scholar, largely a man called Martin West, who's now died. He compiled these into a very useful and accessible book called Ancient Greek Music, 1992. And he transcribed the scores. So what I then could do is actually sing through those to get a sense of what ancient Greek music felt like. Because obviously you're not reconstructing something that was actually heard, because it would have been different every time it was played. It was a different tempo, might have been at a slightly different key, because you didn't have standardized instruments and so on. So what I felt was needed was to get a sense of what this music was like, more than anything. So you can say, if you listen to pop music or you listen to classical music, this is Western music because it has a certain harmonic basis. It uses tones and semitones. It uses harmonic resolutions. It's the same music, even if it's a different genre. So looking at the ancient musical scores, and there were about 60 of them, one can sing through them and say, what do I learn about the idiom, that's what I call it, the idiom of ancient Greek music, The idea being that if you know the idiom, you can then recompose music that would sound familiar to an ancient Greek ear. So as well as having the musical scores that we have, some of which are reasonably lengthy and can be sung, you have the ability to recompose ancient Greek music in a way that it would have sounded at the time. It's not going to be exactly what they did, you're never going to get to that, but you can recompose it using, as it were, the scales, they call them modes.
I'm absolutely fascinated by what you're saying here, because in a way that is what you do in your writing. You imagine, by doing what you do in this book and in your other books, you imagine what it must have been like or may have been like to be them in their time, to feel and think how they did, and how can we today still connect with it. Does that make sense?
I think that's absolutely right. That's what we want to do.
Yeah.
And, you know, we don't have the ears of ancient Greeks. So even if we manage to find a recording of something that was sung and played in 450 BC, if I played it to you now on a recording, it might sound very weedy and out of tune or something to me, but it would have sounded very powerful to them. So when people say, why don't you use some of your ancient Greek music as a sort of background to film music, I say because the impact that ancient Greek music had on its hearers then is not going to be the impact that it has on us now. So find an equivalent. It's a bit like translating.
Yes.
Find an equivalent that is true to what they were trying to do. Make you feel sad, make you feel happy, make you feel romantic, whatever it is. That's what a good film score will be, not something that aims to be authentic.
What's fascinating is that, I keep saying fascinating because you are fascinating. I don't have too many words today at my disposal, apparently. But what's really, truly fascinating is that as I read this, I didn't really care about what is this giving to me as a modern person. I actually wanted to understand them more than borrowing something for our times.
Yes.
And I think that's what you do so well. You kind of open the door into that. If I were to ask you, I will ask you to give us a bit of that ancient Greek music, if you have any recording of that attempt to play.
Well, I don't have any instruments at hand, but one of the most amazing documents is a 4-line song called the Song of Socrates. And it dates from around 200 AD, or perhaps 250 AD. And it's on a circular piece of stone, a column. And what you have is Greek writing in uppercase letters saying, this is a song that will last for all time. And then on the stone, you have the song, this 4-line song, with little symbols above the writing, and those symbols are the notes. And they give you exact melodic indications and some time indication as well. And the song goes like this. I'll sing it in English. While you live, shine bright. Don't let anything you benight. We don't have long for life to spend. To all our lives, time demands an end. Right, so that's the melody. Hoson zis fenu, miden holos silupu, prosoligon estitozin, toteros ochronos apeti. Sung in 200 AD. And when you sing that, you think, that's music. That could be the kind of thing that you heard in Gregorian song in the 10th century. So it's tonal, it revolves around a tone. The only strange thing is the way it ends. It falls down. That's not how we understand an ending. We would normally end on the tonic note ourselves. But rhythmically and melodically, it accords to our notion of what music is. And why that's interesting and important is that, I mean, I studied music at music college, and we were taught that Western music begins in the 10th century with Gregorian song, and that they probably brought it over from Hebrew liturgy, the Psalms.
I was going to say, this sounds a bit like Hebrew prayer.
Well, I mean, we were told that that was how Western music began, and we can then draw a direct line between Gregorian song and the Renaissance and later. But this is 8 centuries prior to that, and it still sounds like that. And it's European. Mm-hmm. It's a European tradition. So instead of saying that Western music begins with an alien tradition being brought into Europe, we can say it was always there. Mm. There was always this sound in the ears, and this is what I mean by the idiom. This kind of sound was in the ears of people in Europe. So that Siculus song was sung in Asia Minor, but some of the other fragments were written by Cretan, the slave of the Emperor Hadrian, so this would have been what Roman music sounded like. And it's that sort of sound you can, so Mesomedes sound, Calliopeia, Calliopeia, da 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 dee da 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 dum. I can't remember the words. Da 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 dum ba bum. That's a melody. Again, music. And music that was sung, 200 AD. And we can then go back, and the most exciting bit of music that I reconstructed from fragmentary papyrus goes back possibly to 400 BC. It's music of Euripides. And it's tonal, and it uses microtones, that is, intervals smaller than a semitone, but it still makes sense to us, makes sense to our ears.
Absolutely. Armand D'Angour, thank you so much for speaking to us for Shop Talk with Writers. You are one of our most interesting guests we've ever had, combining music with words in a very unique way. I must say, the only... Thank you for listening to this episode of Shop Talk with Writers. How to Talk About Love, an ancient guide for modern lovers, is published by Princeton University Press. Check out Armand D'Angour's own Substack and podcast for more illuminating and fun insights into the ancient world. If you're a fan of this author or any other writers we feature on this podcast, please let us know your thoughts about their books and about this conversation. We'd love to hear from you in comments on Spotify, Instagram, Apple, or on my Substack. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Tune in again soon for an exciting new episode with novelist Charlotte Mendelssohn. Thank you.